Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to today's session on tree health and biosecurity. I'm delighted to have you join us today. My name is Sharon Smith, and I'm Community Woodlands Association's Member Support Officer. Today, we're discussing and learning about tree health and biosecurity. We'll dive into the fundamentals of tree health, exploring what makes a tree unhealthy and the specific pests and diseases currently prevalent across Scotland. You'll learn exactly what to do if you're concerned about a tree and where to find reliable information and what the formal process looks like if your trees are found to have a statutory pest or disease. To share their knowledge and expertise, we've invited along today two speakers. We have Matt Parratt from Observatree, and Matt is their scientific coordinator and brings a vast experience of all things pests and diseases to share with you today. And we're also joined by Flora Donald from Scottish Forestry. And Flora will bring lots of advice today on what to do if you suspect that your trees may have a pest, infection or disease. And what happens if you are issued a statutory plant health notice. I'm certainly looking forward to hearing what our speakers have to share. Please do put your questions throughout today's session into the chat, and we'll pick them up at the end at a Q&A session for you all. So before we dive into the actual session, please just allow me to chat to you a little bit about CWA, what we do and how you can become a member. Essentially, at the heart of our work, we support our members to achieve their aspirations in their woodlands. We currently have 177 members, most of whom are community groups owning or managing woodland in Scotland. There are many benefits to becoming a member of CWA. Firstly, we advocate for our members in the political arena, responding to consultations when they are required. We provide support and advice to communities who are looking to start up a community woodland group and or who already have a woodland and are looking for ongoing support. We connect and join the dots for people, which is a huge part of my role specifically. We achieve that through listening to our members' needs and then supporting with training sessions such as today's, exchange visits to see other community woodlands on site in person, mentoring programmes, and we also have our annual conference. We provide professional support. We have two team members, two Forester members, Piers Hoysett and Alice Brawley, who are able to provide paid advice and consultancy to any member groups. And we work in partnership with strategic partners across Scotland to make it easier for our communities to be actively involved in woodland management. And if you would like to consider becoming a member, you can either join us as a group or you can join us as an individual, and to do so you can scan this code here, or I will put the link into the chat as the session goes. So without any further delay, I'm going to hand you over to Matt. Matt, when you're ready, if you take control of the slides, and I look forward to hearing what you've got to say. Thank you.
Here we go. Hopefully everybody can hear me. Sharon, can you give me a thumbs up? Yeah, great, excellent. Thanks for inviting us here today. So I'm just going to crack on. So got quite a lot to get through today to give you some background, as Sharon described, and also what you can do if you think you've got pests or diseases and how you can get an angle on them before they get too well established, perhaps. So as has already been said, my title is Scientific Coordinator for Observatory. That sounds terribly grandiose, but essentially what I do is act as a bridge between our citizen science volunteers and tree health researchers, forest research and FERA. So I plan and deliver a lot of the training resources and materials for all 200 of our volunteers. My background is kind of a bit varied. I started in silviculture, moved through ecology, and now find myself in tree health. But I've also got a bit of background in botanical ID training with the FSC, BSBI, and various wildlife trusts. So that's a little bit about me, so you've got an idea of my background. I'm not an entomologist, I'm not a pathologist, so I've come into tree health from a slightly different angle, perhaps. So this is what we're going to cover today. I'm going to start with the problem, and that is this rise in non-native tree pests and diseases. I'll talk a little bit about what happens up at GB level, but then how that relates to what you can do on the ground. Then I'll hand over to Flora to talk about what happens if you found something, reported it, what next? Importantly, resources. And then I thought I'd give you a little flavour of some of the key pests and diseases that you can be looking out for and how to spot them. So this is our graph, which shows what we're dealing with here. So pests and diseases are nothing new. We've got lots that are native to the UK, but we've started to see an increase in the rate of new ones coming in and causing problems. We can go back as far as the 60s and 70s with the waves of Dutch elm disease. Then things start to pick up. Kind of 1983, Great Spruce bark beetle was found in Shropshire, down in southern England, and that is now spreading up through Scotland. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And then probably the biggie in current sort of memory is really ash dieback. And there can't be anybody who's involved with trees who hasn't heard of it or seen it, because since its detection back in 2012, it has spread over most of the UK. And ash dieback is really what triggered the start of Observatree, this citizen science program that I'm involved with. More recently, we've had Ips typographus, this little quite cute looking but unpleasant bark beetle that attacks spruce trees, arriving in the UK, down in southeast England from the continent, where it's caused a lot of damage. And then most recently, plain lacebug, which has pitched up in central London. So this is an ongoing issue. We're seeing more and more things coming in. But the key really is, what can we do about it? It's at the GB level, we're looking really at something called the Plant Biosecurity Strategy for GB that's set to run for 5 years. And it comes down to 4 real sort of ideas. And the first one is just stop them getting in the first place. So prevent them. And this means things like phytosanitary requirements. So if you're importing plants, they have to be checked and certified as being clear of any signs of pests or diseases. And that can happen at the departure point when they arrive in the UK, but then also nursery inspections. So every step of the way, there's an inspection process to check that nothing nasty is in there. Sometimes things get through. And so if that happens, the next step is to eradicate it. So get in quick, eliminate it, and stop it spreading. If we get it early, that's reasonably achievable. But again, if things get through at that level, then we move on to containment. So once we've got it, we can try and stop it spreading, or at least slow down the spread. And that essentially buys us time to look at ways of controlling it. And more importantly, if it then becomes more widely established, we can look at ways of learning to live with it, i.e. mitigate for it. And that can come down to things like management strategies. So Observatree is this citizen science program. And this was set up, like I say, at the behest of ash dieback, really. That's when it came in. How does it work? Well, firstly, it is a citizen science program. It is led by Forest Research, but it is a partnership, and we can't emphasize the importance of that enough, really. And the partners are listed across the bottom of that slide. It's probably quite wee for you there, but it includes people like Flora's team, Scottish Forestry, but also down in England, National Trust, and FERA, but really importantly, the Woodland Trust. So Forest Research leads on the science, the Woodland Trust lead on volunteer management, because they have a lot of experience in that. So each partner brings something useful and unique to the partnership. We try and keep a network of around 200 volunteers. That way we can put our time and efforts into making sure they are some of the best trained and most skilled volunteers out there. So we give them some pretty intensive training, and that's ongoing throughout their time with the project. Primarily, we ask them to keep an eye out for 24 priority pests and diseases. These are observatory priorities, not necessarily those of the other organisations that are involved in tree health. We also ask our volunteers to keep an eye out for things that are concerning, but which aren't necessarily one of these priorities. So that's where this idea of healthy versus unhealthy comes in. To do that, we do put a lot of time and effort into our training and resources, which is what I'm involved with. We've got our website, we've got ID guides, something called Host of the Month, webinars, and face-to-face training, which is a really important part of what we do. I'm going to cover that in more detail towards the end. So what do they actually do? We've got these 200 highly skilled observers out there. And in essence, they're there to support the plant biosecurity strategy for Great Britain that I mentioned earlier. And they do this in 4 ways. So they carry out what we call general surveys. They'll approach a group of trees. It doesn't have to be woodland. What we say is, if it's got trees, it's a valid survey site. So it could be a street, it could be a park, it could be a private garden, or it could be a woodland as well. We also have a program of what we call sentinel tree surveys. So these are trees that are revisited up to 4 times a year for as many years as that volunteer is with the project. And we started this in 2017. So we're at the point now where we've got a good 8 years of data. And the longer this goes on, the more powerful that data will become and the more useful. Really importantly, we ask them to report when they find trees that haven't got any signs of pests or diseases. It's easy to look at a map and go, okay, ash dieback was found there. But when you've got a blank spot on the map, we don't know whether that's because nobody's looked for it there or because it's just not there. So a healthy tree report tells us at that time and place, that disease or its signs and symptoms were not seen in that area. So that's a really important part of the picture. And then finally, they participate very enthusiastically in what we call targeted surveys. And these are generally very short term, they're research led, and it might be looking out for things like chorea, an organism I'll talk about a bit later. So we task our volunteers to go out and look for a very specific thing in particular locations. So they do an awful lot. I'm just going to put in a quick plug here that we are currently looking to increase our volunteer numbers. So particularly in the Scottish borders and northwest Scotland, where we've got a bit of a bare patch. So if you're interested, then get in touch because we are starting recruitment, well, basically now. Outside of the official monitoring and observatory monitoring, what can you do? Again, we come back to this idea of preventing and practicing good biosecurity at all scales. So this is locally, personally, as well as the national effort on biosecurity. Firstly, what does it mean? It's a term that we throw around quite a lot now. What we're looking at here is the pest and disease cycle. So a pest and disease needs to move around to continue being alive, basically. Especially if it's a killer, it doesn't want to get stuck with a dead host. So it moves, and it will move in a variety of ways, either through soil and organic material, water, or live plants as well. Unfortunately, we as people are superb vectors. So we're a little transport system primed and ready for any pest or disease that wants to explore and find new hosts. And that's very easily done on tools, on vehicles, on our footwear, on our clothing, or on equipment like chainsaws or climbing gear. So what we have to do really is break that cycle. And it can be as simple as washing off your boots to remove any trace of soil or organic debris before you leave the site. This is really important. So what starts on the site stays on the site. And all you need is a scrubbing brush, some water, and something to scrub your boots in. That can be good enough. To break it down into a couple of quite simple categories, always think about your kit. So remove all soil and organic material before entering and leaving the site. So arrive clean and depart clean as well. Think about your transport. So if you are taking a vehicle, park on a hard standing where possible. And if you can, try and remove all soil and organic material from your vehicle before leaving the site. That is not easy. It's a big area on a car, but do the best you can. And finally, think trees, plants, and materials. So ideas like responsibly sourcing your plants and keep accurate records. If something does get found, then accurate records can help us trace back through a supply chain and go out and look for it and possibly even do things like eliminate it from other sites. So records are really important. Where you can really help as well is regular monitoring. So get to know your trees and look for signs and symptoms of ill health. So monitoring your trees, how do you even do this for a start? So I'm going to introduce the idea of ill health in trees. And my apologies, I don't have an English language version of this little diagram, but dying tree is the essence of it. But it illustrates that actually a dying tree might also be host to a huge range of other organisms. So it's important to notice that trees interact with a really large and complex range of organisms throughout their life cycle. Interactions that result in a negative effect upon the tree, we can kind of broadly say, okay, this is unhealthy. And where that cause is biological, we call them pests or pathogens. So that could include insects, it could include nematodes, or it could include fungi, bacteria, viruses. So a big range of potential pests or pathogens. Trees are also affected by the environment they live in, and particularly climate. Anything that's not biological we call abiotic, and in that case, the problems they cause in the trees are called disorders. This is the big question, and you're probably going to throw things at the screen because there's not a black and white yes/no answer here. There's no clear divide between a healthy and an unhealthy tree, okay? It's a continuum from a completely healthy tree, free of any signs of symptoms or signs of negative effects of pests or diseases, like the rowan on the left, full of berries, looking perfectly happy there, right the way through to dead. And the rowan on the right is absolutely full of honey fungus. That's definitely dead at this stage. Whole shades of grey in between those two. So there is no right or wrong definition. That upsets a lot of people because we like to have nice clear categories. But any definition which you do use is dependent upon the context in which it's used. Okay, I'm sorry, it's not nice and easy, but this just gives you an idea of how difficult it is to say, well, is this healthy or is it unhealthy? Is it part of the natural ecology of the tree? Or what do we mean by natural? Okay, so it's a grey area. But we can start to look at a few things that we need to consider when we're trying to get an idea of whether the tree is healthy or unhealthy. Sometimes it's pretty easy to spot, oh, something's wrong here, especially if you've got a whole group of trees and just one of them is looking off colour or atypical. And the word typical is really important here. I don't like using the word normal. I think typical is more useful. So what is typical for any given tree? So that applies to the species, and probably not so much of a concern for yourselves, but in parks and gardens, horticultural variety too. What's typical? What does it look like most of the time? True age and life cycle, and where it is in that cycle can radically alter what the tree looks like. A lot of you, I'm sure, will know about veteran trees or ancient trees. As trees get to great age, they're a bit like us. They start to develop a few cracks and wrinkles, bits fall off. So for them, that's perfectly typical. growing conditions, and we have to bring in management here as well. A coppice tree doesn't look anything like a mature specimen, but it doesn't mean it's unhealthy. So you have to consider that. Similarly, if you've got a site that's close to the coast, you might have trees that are very gnarled and low growing. That's fine. That's typical for them. It doesn't mean necessarily that they're unhealthy. And really what we're talking about is visible signs and symptoms. What can you see that raises an eyebrow? And this comes down to pests and pathogens and also those disorders, the abiotic causes. So I'm going to go through a few of the things to look at. I'm not worrying about causes here. This is all about observing, how to observe, and how to gather the information. What sorts of things do you need to be looking for? It's usually best to start with the whole tree. So what does it look like from a distance? These are the things that catch your eye and draw you in, the little flags. And I think it comes down to three things really. Crown thinning. So how transparent is the canopy? Are there signs of dieback? Or is it dropping its leaves when it shouldn't be? So crown thinning on the left, that's a tree suffering from acute oak decline. We can see far too much daylight through that tree. There should be far more leaves on it. So that's a good sign that, oh, okay, I might go and look a bit more closely at this tree. The spruce in the middle there clearly has something going on at the top of it. There's some dieback there. So you might want to get in and see if you can spot something below that point. And the plane tree on the right has Cancastana plane. Now, that is not an issue in the UK yet. And being a plane tree, it's probably not something you're going to be too worried about in your community woodlands. But this picture was taken in July. A plane tree should not be dropping its leaves in July. October, yes. July, no. So something's wrong. Something's not typical. So once you've been drawn in, you can start to look more closely. The foliage is a really good thing to look at. And I'm talking about all forms of foliage here, from needles, scale leaves, and the more familiar broadleaves. And it can affect the foliage in a range of different ways. So you might see discoloration. The extent and the location of the discoloration can be important. So is it just on the margins, like the picture on the left of hornbeam? And this was attributed to drought, and it's this kind of scorching around the margins is pretty common when you've got drought. Or is it patchy or spotty, like the picture of the pine needles there that have got Dophthostroma needle blight? And then we've got beech leaf disease, where we get these odd bands between the veins on beech leaves. It's another one that's not here yet. We hope it doesn't get here. You can get combinations as well. So this oak leaf on the right has some marginal scorching, but it's also got some little chlorotic or yellow dots all over it as a result of leafhopper damage. So you can easily get multiple different things going on within the same tree. Another good thing from a distance is the presence of excessive or even permanent wilting or dead leaves. A number of different causes here. If you see this, a good thing to do is to trace that shoot back to where it ceases being dead leafed and see what you can see, because a really big cause of this is squirrel damage, particularly grey squirrels. And some years we get an awful lot of this. The year before last, we had so many reports of it and people didn't believe it was squirrels. So some years, for some reason, we get much more squirrel damage, but there are other things as well. So ash dieback typically causes these dark wilted leaves in the early part of summer. And then things like sweet chestnut blight in the middle, where all the leaves have died, but they're still hanging on. And then a plane tree with another fungal pathogen, anthracnose, on the right. So that's worth exploring if you start to see this sort of thing. Insects. Yeah, lots of insects like to eat trees. Doesn't mean they're necessarily a problem, but you can start to get some clues. So feeding signs. The one on the left is one of the best pests to recognise. I love it. It's called elm zigzag sawfly. For obvious reasons, it does what it says on the tin. Other pests might just eat the veins of the leaf. They're very particular, like Asian longhorn beetle. And then we've got plain lacebug in the third picture across from the left, with lots of spots of lacebug poo, or frass as we call it. And they feed on the sap on the underside of leaves. And then horse chestnut leaf miner that feeds between the two layers of the leaf, leaving you these transparent windows with little dots of frass and sometimes the insect itself. You might also see deformations or distortions of the leaf. And we have a huge number of things that cause galls of various types in leaves. And a lot of those we might say part of the normal ecology of the tree, but sometimes they're not. So sweet chestnut is quite unique in only having one thing that produces galls on it, and that's oriental chestnut gall wasp. But you might get things like powdery mildews, which looks like someone's dusted the leaves. Or you can get effects by aphids that cause the leaves to curl and fold. So deformations and distortions can be another good clue. A lot of the time the foliage is out of our reach. So we're walking through a woodland and all we can see is trunks or stems. You can still get some useful information from there. And one of the biggies really are bleeds. Now, bleed is essentially it's fluid coming out of the trunk with all sorts of other things in it. And it will look like some of these pictures on the left. So either streaks in the funnels of the bark or sort of blurry ink blot type shapes on this beech tree. In conifers, we can get something called resinosis. So conifers have a habit of spewing out resin when they get damaged or when they're stressed, particularly spruce trees. And these little, I call them resin volcanoes, but they're technically tubes, are a really good sign that you've got Dendroctonus or great spruce bark beetle on your spruce trees. So we can still get clues from tree trunks and stems. Another thing you might see are lesions and cankers. Now, these are, I think, hellish difficult to describe without using technical terminology, but scars on the stems or sometimes even on the bark of the main stem of the trees. Lesions are slightly softer. They can be discolorations like the classic black diamond of ash dieback that we see at the insertion point of a branch. If that lesion persists, the tree can respond by pushing out callus tissue, a bit like scar tissue. And that can lead to what we call a canker. So this is more of an eruption, and it's a result of the tree responding to the presence and the effects of that pathogen. So this sequence just shows you what that can look like with ash dieback. Atypical epicormic shoots. So firstly, what's an epicormic shoot? So we're used to a tree with its normal branching structure. Epicormic shoots come directly from the bark, from little dormant buds that sit there waiting for something to damage the tree. And then they can spring into action and provide a very quick food source. So if you start to see clusters of whippy, quite thin, extending shoots coming out from parts of the tree where you wouldn't expect them, it's worth a close look. Now, very often they'll be associated with a lesion or a canker. The middle picture shows this really well. You've got that crinkly, crusty bit of bark, and then all of the epicormic shoots coming out from just below it. So epicormic shoots are a really good thing to look out for as well and investigate further. Really good one with insects in particular are exit holes. And I'm going to put in brackets entry holes in there as well, because sometimes it's things going into the tree as well as coming out. And in that case, you need to think about the shape. Really importantly, if you find capital D-shaped holes on your trees, that's worth noticing, because they are only caused by a group of insects called agrellus beetles or jewel beetles. Some of those are potentially really unpleasant pests. We've got some native ones. We've got some non-native ones coming in as well. So the shape of the hole is important, the size as well. So if you're taking pictures to submit a report, try and get something in there for scale, ideally a ruler, but a coin or a pen is good as well. You might also see the results of excavation. That can look like fine wood chippings, strands, or dust, sawdust. And that can gather below the tree. The picture on the right is a really severe infestation of spruce bark beetle. So all of that reddish material is frass produced by the beetles tunneling through the bark of the tree. So you've been out, you've got lots of evidence, you've taken some pictures, you've made lots of notes. What do you do with it next? So you need to report your observations. And in GB, we're very lucky. We've got one brilliant way of doing this, and that is called Tree Alert. So this is hosted by Forest Research and is staffed by a team of diagnosticians. So I have sent some resources in, which Sharon will be distributing to you to give you some links to this kind of thing. And one's just popped up in the chat there you can refer back to. So what is Tree Alert? So it was created to capture data on tree pests and diseases across GB. It is really important to say it is open to everybody. It's not just there for industry professionals. So anyone who's got a concern about a tree can file a report. You have to register for it, but you can file a report. It's not just for regulated pests and diseases. It's for any tree health concerns. It covers both biotic and abiotic issues. So pest diseases and things like drought or frost damage as well. So I would strongly encourage you to register and use the system. Registering takes a few minutes, but once you're there, you can then report anything you see. Okay. Once you've submitted that report to Tree Alert, it gets triaged by the team. So my colleague Lucy will sit there and decide, okay, this is the best person to look at this. The diagnostics team will then go through a process of trying to identify what they think is wrong. They might request some samples. They will talk you through how to gather those samples, but don't get a sample before they ask you to. That's really important because they will tell you exactly the material that they need and how to collect it. They might also decide that they would like to come and visit the site and have a little look for themselves. Once they've gone through the process, they will get their response to you, and that will be tailored individually to each user. Now, it's important to say that this isn't always fast. It can take time, especially for pathology. So for the diseases, there are a lot of steps involved. Insects are a bit easier, especially if you have the insect. ID can quite often be done just from a photo. But for the diseases, there are lots of steps. So it can take sometimes a couple of months or more. And there are certainly times when we cannot give you a definitive answer. That's just the way it is. It's really disheartening, but sometimes that happens. So this is the point where I'm going to hand over to Flora.
Thanks, Matt. Oh, too far. There we go. Well, it's lovely to be here. Thank you for including me in this webinar. So Matt gave me the unenviable task of following his lovely slides. So I've got about 15 minutes to talk about what happens next with some of your tree alerts. Why would Scottish Forestry become involved? What would happen next? And then how else do we use the tree alert information that you send in? So my name is Flora Donald. I'm Tree Health Policy Officer based in the Tree Health team in Scottish Forestry. So Scottish Forestry is the agency responsible for forestry policy, support and regulation. And sometimes we get a bit confused with Forestry and Land Scotland. They are also a government agency, but they manage land. So we regulate them in the same way that we regulate all the other forestry sectors. So Matt left us with, you've sent in your tree alert, it's gone to a diagnostician. If you've submitted it from Scotland, it will go to Northern Research Station based in outside Edinburgh, and they may get in touch with you asking for more information. And then they have a decision to make about whether they escalate your finding or not. So why would they escalate it? Well, if they suspect it's in a subset of pests and diseases that I'm today going to call regulated pests or diseases, but you might hear them called other things like statutory pests, then they have to pass that information to Scottish Forestry Tree Health team. And in addition to that, there are other times where they might think, oh, this is perhaps something that we don't see in Scotland very much. Maybe it's found in England, but not so much in Scotland, so it's quite interesting. Or perhaps they're already working with us on a particular topic of interest. So, for example, at the moment, our tree health officers are interested in web blight and trying to collect some distribution data about where that is. And so that's an example where the diagnostician might think, oh, I think I'll pass this on to someone in the tree health team to let them know about it and to perform a site visit. So there's the reasons that they absolutely have to share information, and then there's, we're learning together and we're trying to sort of collaborate and find out more. So there's those less formal ways of working as well. So who are the tree health officers? Well, there's 3 of them, Daphne, Ewan and Jim, and I've put their patches on the map so you can see they cover huge areas. They do an awful lot of driving. They are incredibly knowledgeable about pests and diseases, signs and symptoms. They're very hardworking and they're great to talk to. And their manager is Barnaby Wilder, who's our operations manager. So when your tree alert comes in from a diagnostician, it will go to one of our data officers. They will share the information with Barnaby and he will assign it to somebody. As Tree Health team, we also do a lot of our own surveillance. That's multi-annual and annual surveys, including aerial surveillance from helicopters and extensive trapping networks. So it's not just tree alerts that we get information about, it's all those other networks as well, but the process is the same. So we would follow up with a ground survey. And if it's not us, because particularly after aerial surveillance, we have an awful lot of sites to go and look at, we do have subcontractors, and they've worked with us for a long time, and they're particularly good at things like remorum disease and bark beetles that we commonly see. So in most of Scotland, we work with Weir Forestry, and in Highland, picture here is Alistair. He works for field services team at Forest Research, and so we might subcontract some work to him as well. So who turns up depends a little bit on what's suspected. And the first that you'll hear is you'll get an email or a phone call from one of our data officers saying, your tree alert's been passed to us, or we've got reason to suspect there's a regulated pest or disease or a pest disease of interest on your ground, and they'll send you sort of information about where it is with a map and what is suspected, and ask you for any constraints you might have. So for example, have you got active harvesting going on your site that we need to be aware of? Are there gate codes? Anything like that would concern you about us accessing the site. We try and follow up as soon as possible, but of course, sometimes when we have these big influxes of surveys, there might be a bit of a delay between that initial contact and then a contractor actually coming out, or one of us coming out to inspect. But we'll have your contact details and we'll pre-arrange that with you to make sure you know what day we are actually going to arrive. And then when the surveyor's on site, they will do a visual inspection. So they're really looking for the sort of easiest to access tree with the best level of symptoms that are diagnostic or representative of what's going on in your trees. And in the majority of cases, they will take a sample. Sometimes they may fly a drone. If it's tree health officers, they may fly a drone. That's particularly if the symptoms are up in the canopy and you get a much better view of what's going on with that top-down view rather than looking sort of from underneath the canopy. And occasionally, of course, we turn up and we know what's going on, but it's not anything that we would take any further action on. So there's sort of 3 options as to what happens when we turn up. Take a sample and send that back to the diagnostic labs, or we decide that there's nothing to follow up on. That doesn't mean that there's no further action for you to take. I'll talk about that more in a moment. Or there's a very small percentage of sites where we can't quite pinpoint what's going on and think that perhaps the symptoms just aren't well enough developed. So we can put that down as to monitor and come back another year and see if it's any clearer what's going on. But as I say, that's usually a small number of sites. And we act on field evidence. So, you wouldn't receive any follow-up communication from us, or it's highly, highly unusual that you would receive a statutory notice or any follow-up from us if we haven't been out on site and collected a sample and had that diagnostic test result back. So that's really important to stress. And then what happens next is specific to the pest or disease. So if something's found that's not a regulated pest or disease, we've got lots of information in different places, toolkits to help you with surveying and planning, guidance on specific pests and diseases and the best way to manage them. You can be considering tree health as part of any sort of planning process that you're actively going through. And Matt's already talked about biosecurity. And I would go further and say that sometimes biosecurity, I think, includes things like rerouting paths away from high-risk areas if you've got, access, or it could be changing direction, so that people are always visiting the not infected places before they visit the infected places. It's quite a broad range of measures beyond just boot washing, which is also very important. But as you said, there is a subset of pest or diseases where we would issue a statutory notice. So what is that? So to sort of explain it, I have to go right the way out to international law. So the UK is a signatory to the International Plant Protection Convention. It's a treaty under the FAO, and I've written there what it says, but basically it's a trade treaty. So it's to make sure that if we're accepting plants or timber or wood packaging material, anything like that, that the country it's come from is certifying that particular pests and diseases aren't present, or is surveying enough to make sure that they can say what level of presence or absence there is, and they are adhering to phytosanitary measures that pre-treat the material, so it's really unlikely that we would be importing anything with a pest or disease. So it's defensive for us, but it's also protective. It allows us, we are held to the same standards. It's allowed us to send trade to other countries, and they have an understanding of what they are at risk of importing or not importing. But in the UK, plant and tree health is devolved to each of the 4 nations. So it's actually Scottish ministers that set out the regulatory and policy approaches to tree health in Scotland. So compared to my colleagues in Scottish Forestry, we actually have a different minister. We report to the Minister for Agriculture and Connectivity. And we have our own generic contingency plan, we have our own Scottish plant health strategy, and we have a Chief Plant Health Officer who convenes with the Chief Plant Health Officers of the other countries, and that's how we get together and take a sort of shared UK representation on different pests and diseases. But devolution does mean that we have the ability to act in different ways that in accordance with our government priorities, and also our different geographical and structure of forestry in Scotland. But of course, pests and diseases don't respect borders, so we do work as part of the UK Plant Health Service. We work very collaboratively with other agencies and government departments in the UK. Okay, so I'm finally getting to what does regulated pest actually mean. This is from our website. You can go and see a bit more information about the legislative side on our website, and we've got this table. So I'm trying to give an example from each of these classifications of regulated pest. So the top tier, Matt's already mentioned Ips topographus, the H-toothed spruce bark beetle. It's a priority pest. So priority pests are listed in the legislative annex. There's, I think, maybe 12-ish species that affect trees in Scotland, and these are the big hitters. They're the ones where the damage that they cause is so significant environmentally, economically, and socially that we have to do extra preparation for them. So the onus is on the tree health team to do some public awareness campaigns. We have to have a specific contingency plan about what we would do, and we would carry out very strong eradication or containment measures if a population was found. So as Matt mentioned, we've already got IPS topographers in England on areas of stressed spruce. They are under eradication, and they are putting a lot of effort into not allowing populations of this beetle to establish, partly to protect the spruce resource that we have in Scotland. The tier below that is pests or diseases that are not present in GB or have limited presence. And so again, we'd be, if we found breeding populations, we'd be trying to eradicate or contain them. So this example is oak processionary moth. Again, it's present in England, particularly in central London. We are trapping for it in the central belt in Scotland. We think that's the most likely place where it would arrive first. And again, the aim of monitoring and regulation there is to detect it as soon as possible and to try and eradicate it so the populations wouldn't build up and spread. And then the final two classifications are pests or diseases that are more likely to have some presence in GB. And so for a provisional quarantine pest, it's usually for things that are newly arrived and we don't really understand enough about the biology. So as a precautionary measure, we're trying to eradicate or contain while we also conduct further research to understand actually what the implications and the impact of that pest or disease population is going to be. And regulated non-quarantine pests are pests that are present in GB, but we've decided that the impacts are severe enough that we want to still do containment measures to prevent them from spreading any further. So the one in this category that you've probably heard of is remorum disease, caused by Phytophthora remorum, which is a wind-dispersed pathogen, and it causes really significant death of large trees very quickly, as this picture here shows. So they're a subset of pests and diseases that we have to particularly follow up on, and we're not expecting you to know, what's regulated, what's not regulated. Put in your tree alert. The diagnosticians will alert us if they suspect any of these pests or diseases are present. And then if they come back with a positive or a confirmed finding, this is when we may issue a statutory plant health notice or an SPHN. And an SPHN is a legal notice that means landowners are required to take a specific action. The action and the location and the deadline for each of the actions will be detailed in the SPHN. So the information should all be there for you. And the action that it could mandate, it varies. So SPHNs have become synonymous with tree felling within a radius, so not just symptomatic trees, but trees that are likely to be infected because they're in close proximity to infected trees, but they may not yet be symptomatic. But there's other things that we can mandate too, so additional biosecurity measures. It may be that we need to come and inspect timber stacks before it's moved off-site. You may need to move the timber to an authorised processor, so these processors are licensed to destroy the material in a way that would stop any further spread of whatever the infection is. And in a very small number of cases, it could also be chemical treatments. So the SPHNs aren't issued by Tree Health Team. We pass that information all over to your local conservancy. It'll be your local woodland officer who you'll be dealing with. So if you don't understand anything in the notice, or there's something causing you a particular problem, sometimes to access the trees, you might need to put infrastructure in. There might be problems with contractors, all of those kinds of things. Just talk to your local woodland officer. They do have some discretion in terms of dates and extensions, not so much the actions that need to be taken, but we can, on a case-by-case basis, consider exactly what you need. But hopefully, there's a relatively small number of you that would ever receive an SPHN, because as I say, it's for a very small number of pests and diseases and on host species, large spruce that you may not grow in large amounts. So most of the time, hopefully, you'll be more in this sustainable forest management area where it's trying to take actions, as Matt said, that prevent, contain, stop the spread of problems. And really the takeaway, if you take anything away from today, it's that stress trees are at higher risk of there being problems. And there's lots of things that cause stress. So one thing we see quite a lot is mechanical damage. You know, if after thinning operations or after infrastructure's been put in, trees are damaged by those, and then they are sitting there at really high risk of bark beetle invasion, because it's much easier to infest trees when they have that level of stress. Matt talked about the disease cycle. I sometimes call it a pathway. It still has kind of these 4 stages, so transport, introduction, establishment, and spread. Pest or disease population has to be able to maintain at each of these stages in the pathway to reach the next one. So you have an opportunity at each of those stages to intervene or to try to do something that either slows it down or actually eradicates it from your site. So there are lots of different options, and it entirely depends on, you know, what your aims are with your management, what your site location is like, all of those things. So again, a bit like Matt says, it's not that straightforward. I can't give you a here's what you should do to prevent things. But in there's also, you know, that means there's opportunities for, you know, your local decision making and some creativity as to how to handle these problems. So it can be anything from which species you choose to replace with, the suitability that they have on your site, the design of your woodland. Matt mentioned sourcing. It's very important where you get your trees from. Look out for it's called Plant Healthy certification. And if you're growing your own material, have a look at Plant Healthy, because it gives standards for biosecure growing of trees. So do take a look at that. As I said, it can be about reducing damage, and I'm commissioning some work this year looking at when is deadwood good and when is it risky, when does it risk populations of bark beetles coming into your site and building up. So there'll be more guidance hopefully to follow on that. We don't have a one-stop shop for all the kind of tree health guidance and resources. I am trying to build on that with our website to make it more useful, but we do have guidance that's Scottish specific, like the ash dieback toolkit, or that applies GB wide. So for example, there's a management flyer about Phytophthorus cedri on juniper on the Forest Research website, and there's a new threat to Scots pine that we're investigating, but we've already got some management guidance on the Plant Health Centre website, which is another place where there's lots of great resources. So just to finish up, I'll sort of go back to where we started about your tree alert. We don't just use tree alert to get a diagnosis and then, you know, forget about it. All of the data is collated and reported back to us in various different ways. So, I mean, the aim of tree alert is really the earlier detection. The earlier we can find a pest or disease, the easier and cheaper it is to intervene and to stop it causing further problems. But tree alert's also used, you know, to understand the risks posed by different pests or diseases, whether they're regulated or not, and the impacts. And there's a lot of, you know, growing awareness at the moment about interactions between abiotic stresses such as drought and outbreaks of pests and diseases. So that's why reporting your abiotic and also your healthy trees to tree alert is really important. The information helps us understand trends. So for example, last year when it was really dry, we noticed we got an uptick in bark beetle reports on tree alert really early. So we know that bark beetles were emerging earlier than normal, which means they could potentially have more generations over the summer, which means that this year we may unfortunately see sort of larger populations. And we know that because of the reports that were sent in. We can also use tree alert to identify where we may need to spend additional surveillance resources. All of the information is of course helpful whenever we're commissioning research projects. And we're also starting to use it to understand if comms are working. So for example, DEFRA's done a lot of work with its topographers, you know, putting out releases in newspapers, trying to get features in television programs, and sort of tracking the response with the number of tree alerts that people have been sending in as a way to understand, are we reaching the right audiences? Are people becoming aware of this messaging? And then of course, tree alerts also inform Scottish GB and UK tree health strategies and the contingency and action plans that we draw up. So I think that was quite a high level overview. I hope it was helpful. Very happy to answer questions. And, you know, if you have sort of particular feedback about information that you would like to find, but you don't know where it is, something that we could signpost to better on our website, then please do get in touch or let Sharon know, and we'll follow up.
Thank you very much, Flora. That was really useful. And we've got some good questions coming into the chat that we can look at the end of the next bit. I think we'll take 5 minutes just to stand up and stretch your legs. It's, in fact, if we even just take 4 minutes and come back at 3 o'clock on the dot, that would be great. I'll see you soon. Don't leave the meeting, just turn your camera off and your mic. I hope you all had time to at least get out of your seats, everybody. Okay, brilliant, thank you. Okay, Matt, whenever you're ready.
Great, thanks, Sharon. I saw a question in the chat asking about some pest diseases to look out for. Which ones are important? This is a partial answer to that coming up in the next few slides. So it's just a bit of a taster. of some of the things that you might come across and some things that we're interested in hearing about as well. So I'm going to start with this little beauty, which used to be called Correa Pythiophila. That is in the process of changing thanks to some brilliant new research from one of my colleagues, but for the moment I'm going to stick with this name. Now this is a bit strange in that it isn't a pest or a disease, it's a complex, so it's a bit of both. And it's this little adelgid called Pineus pinei, which is a bit like an aphid in some ways, and a fungus called the Correa Pythiophila, and they get together to cause some problems for Scots pine. So it's got an interesting backstory. It was first reported in the literature in around the 1900s, and then things went kind of quiet until 2022, when it started to appear on Scots pine and started to cause a few concerns. The map on the right hand side shows where it's being confirmed. I think it's going to be too small for you to see the differences, but it's been found in Caledonian pinewood, in native woodland plantings, and in commercial plantations. So it's not terribly choosy where it goes. Basically, if it's got Scots pine, it could pop up there, and it would be really useful for us to know where else it is in those gaps in between it there. So here are some of the key symptoms. So I'm not going to suggest that you all sit there spooning caviar into your mouths with a horn spoon, but a really good description of it when it's in its early stage is caviar-like around branches. So it looks like someone has smeared caviar around the branches, slightly bobbly, dark. An alternative description might be the little bobbly pink and blue licorice all sorts that you either loved or hated, but in black. So think of that kind of texture wrapped around a little branch. Now, as it becomes established, you end up getting cankers. So that can then affect nutrient and water transport to other parts of the tree. And dead young trees are incredibly difficult to photograph, but the photo on the right there shows a little Scots pine with severe dieback in dead shoots. So this is a good one to get started on, certainly, because that caviar-like fungal mass is really quite visible. So if you find that kind of thing, please. Another really important one is this lovely organism called Phytophthora ostracedri. Phytophthora means plant destroyer. So these are a group of fungus-like organisms that attach a whole range of different species. So potato blight, the cause of the Irish famine, was a Phytophthora. So it covers a whole range of things, but the one in particular that we're interested in here is called ostracedri, and that affects common juniper, Juniperus communis, all across the UK. So the first record was in 2011 in the UK. The picture on the left shows you the kind of impact it can have. This picture is in Upper Teesdale in northern England, and all of those orangey, gingery shrubs are dead. So this is ripping through populations of juniper across the UK and causing serious problems. Now, key symptoms to look out for. Once they get to the orange stage, they're really obvious. So if you start to see orange-looking junipers on your sites, you definitely want to be getting a tree alert in. But just before that, they go through a kind of a bronzy look as well. They go through that orange stage, and then the needles will fall off and you get skeletons, really. If the trees are on your land and you own them, then you could possibly have a look at the base of the tree. So this is a root pathogen that kills the trees at the base, hence everything above it gets into trouble and dies. And one of the signs that you can find if you scrape away the bark on a tree you think is affected are these kind of flame or tongue-shaped lesions that are, I was going to say nice cinnamon colour. That's maybe not quite the right way of phrasing it. There are other phytophthora that can affect junipers and some other pests and diseases as well. So this one would require lab analysis to confirm it. But if you've got any concerns, tree alert it. And this is a really good point to hammer home. Tree alert it and let the diagnosticians go through their processes. We would rather hear about something and come back to you and say, okay, this is fine, it's not a big problem, than not hear about it. And then in 5 years' time, we realised that sighting would have been ground zero for it. So don't be afraid to put in a report. The diagnosticians will do their job and they will come back to you if it's important or not important. It's really important to keep that in mind. Another important one, which some of you may have heard of in the past, called red band needle blight, is Dothystroma needle blight. This is another fungus. It is hosted by pines. Quite recent, 1990s, this really started to appear. And it affects some of the pines more than others. So Corsican pine and lodgepole pine are very susceptible. Scots pine less so, but if we've got a lot of it around the area, there are a lot of spores drifting around, and that increases the chances of Scots pine being tackled by it. So another really useful one to get to grips with some of the key symptoms of this to look out for. So from a distance, you might see what we call lion's tail shoots. So these are just little mops of the current year's needles. All of the previous year's needles have been disposed of thanks to the action of the fungus. And it also causes kind of a compression at the top of the shoots. So that year's extension growth is really short, hence this lion's tail look. If you get a bit closer and look at the needles, you might see these characteristic kind of reddish looking bands on the needles, not right through the year. You'll also see as the infection progresses, the base of the needle stays green, but above that band, they will die. So they get two colours there. In the centre of the bands, if you've got a hand lens, like a little ×10, you might see the little black fruit bodies there. Again, pines suffer from an awful lot of different needle pathogens. They can look very similar. So there's lots of other things out there that could cause similar looking symptoms. And when we get to the resources, I'll point you at some places to give you some of those lookalikes and how to tell them apart. This one has a ridiculously long name, European mountain ash ring spot associated virus. There isn't really a nice, simple, pronounceable abbreviation. So ring spot, we'll call it, or mountain ash ring spot, and it's caused by, unsurprisingly, a virus, the Emarovirus sorbi. Main host appears to be mountain ash or rowan, but it has popped up on a few other sorbus, or what used to be called sorbus. Again, very new, 2013, and we're really not sure how damaging this is, and we don't really have a good idea of the distribution. But it's one that is fairly easy to recognise in the field. So on the rowan, kind of early summer onwards, you start to get, excuse me, these little sclerotic spots on the leaflets. And as it progresses, they coalesce and you can get distinctive kind of rings, or eventually what we call oak leaf pattern. And I think it looks more like a Rorschach ink blot, if everybody knows what they are. If not, it's a good one to Google. So quite nice symptoms to spot, a good one to report on Tree Alert. We had a few mentions earlier of the lovely great spruce bark beetle. So this is the pest that was first detected in the UK in Shropshire in about 83. It is a European native, but it popped up in Shropshire, and we now know that it had probably been there for at least 10 years prior to that, and it has spread. Now, Sitka spruce is our main timber crop species in the UK, but we also have things like Norway spruce and quite a few other ornamental spruces in botanic gardens, parks, etc. And this is bad news for spruce, really. is gradually spreading up through Scotland. So if you've got spruce on your site, there's a good chance you might be trying to remove it from the site. But in the meantime, keep an eye out for the signs and symptoms of this pest, because it would be really useful for us to know where it is within Scotland. Some key symptoms. You're going to see a few of these from a distance. So one of the ones that I mentioned earlier was crown or branch death. And very often this happens at the top of the tree, but it could be branch tips. And the important thing really is that it happens at the tips. It's not starting near the trunk. So the death occurs from the tips inwards and it progresses. And really quite quickly you'll get whole trees that have lost all their needles and essentially they're dead. They will be isolated. They seem to like things like the edges of forest rides. So you'll get quite a few scattered along the edge. Not quite sure why that might be. It might be temperature related because that bit's a bit warmer, for example. If you start to see dead and dying branches on your spruce trees, get in there and have a look at this trunk, and particularly around the base of the trunk, for what we're going to call resin tubes. I like to call them volcanoes. It just fits the description a little bit better. But this happens when the female beetle is trying to chew her way into the spruce to lay eggs. And the spruce responds by pumping out resin to try and deter her. But she's very persistent, so she keeps on going in and out, in and out. And as the resin hardens, you end up with this tube or hole. So it's an entry hole rather than an exit hole. Good one to look out for. Please do tree alert it as well. So that's a really quick little handful of things that you can look out for. But there are others, and this is where staying informed comes into play. So I'm going to rattle through some resources pretty quickly because I want to leave a good amount of time for some discussion as well. The Observatory website is a great place to start. It is the online hub for Observatory itself, but also resources that are available to anybody, not just the volunteers. And there's a little link that's just popped up there for you. Great stuff. Especially note the Get in Touch tab there, so you can contact us through that. One of the main resources there are the priority pests and diseases. So these are observatory priorities, not necessarily those that are applying to the wider industry. They are arranged by host tree species or by the pest or disease. So you can have a look at those and say, oh, I've got something wrong with my ash trees. What might be happening? And it will take you to ash dieback and emerald ash borer, for example. When you dive into that, you'll get information about the pest or disease, their background, the signs and symptoms, and the lookalikes as well. So it's an excellent resource. You can download the field guides as PDFs. There's no charge for those. That's all there for you to make use of. So those are the field guides that I mentioned. We've also got something called Host of the Month. This is where we take a particular species of tree or genus and we explore the things that you're going to see at that particular time of year. So currently we're in spruce, so no surprises. It was great spruce bark beetle, and next month we move into Lawson cypress and Phytophthora lateralis. So it can give you an idea of things that are good to look for at that time of year. You'll also find a range of blogs there, quite often with bits of interest from across the tree health world, so not just Observatory by any means. You'll also find some training videos going through some of the signs and symptoms, and occasionally we post webinar recordings on there as well. So there's a lot of information. This is a typical field guide layout, so background information jam-packed with signs and symptoms, descriptions and photographs, and really importantly, the lookalikes. So things that might be mistaken for that pest or disease, but if you think you've found something but are not sure, tree alert it. Okay. Don't feel, oh, I feel a bit stupid. don't worry about it. Get in a report. We'd rather hear about it. Host of the month. So this includes a bit of background about the host. We also try and include some ID on the host as well. So oak is coming up soon. They're still not quite going to have their leaves up here in Scotland in particular. So we've got a little bit about how to identify 4 species of oak from their winter buds, for example. And then we go on to talk about acute oak decline. So there's lots of information there that you can access. Highly recommend the FR website if you want a bit more of a deep dive. So this covers pest diseases. We can also think of mammals and other things as pests. So wild boar, squirrels. So you can find information about all of those on the FR website. And that includes things like signs and symptoms, maybe some management advice, distributions as well. So someone was asking about maps. That's a good place to look for that. But it also acts as a bit of a knowledge hub. So another good place for you to have a look at. I'm now going to try and summarize all of that sentence by sentence. So non-native pests and diseases are on the increase, and that is ongoing. It is not going to stop anytime soon. We looked at the GB plant biosecurity strategy, and those 4 words really: prevent it, eradicate it, contain it, and mitigate for it. And that can apply globally, nationally, and locally, and personally as well on your own patch. Biosecurity really is one of your best friends with this. It's easy to do, and it can make a difference. Look at your trees, get familiar with them. Look for those atypical colorings or other signs and symptoms and report it, tree alert it. We looked at a few locally relevant pests and diseases, and then I covered another really important kind of linchpin: and stay informed. So make use of those resources, keep up to date on all of the things that are out there for you to keep an eye out for. So thanks for listening at that point. And I think we're now going to open up the floor to some discussion. So I'm going to stop sharing.
Thank you very much for that, Matt. And it was a really good summary at the end of all that you've covered, an incredible amount in such a short period of time. So thank you. I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing the slides so that we can actually see each other. Unless you would like to refer back to some slides, shall I just leave the slides up just now?
No, we can take them down, Sharon. I think we'll be okay. And if we need to go back, we can do that.
Right. Stop sharing. Okay. So I've put in a lot of those links. There's a couple more to add in at the end of the links that you sent through, Matt. But let's go to the questions. I'm just scrolling back up. So Kelsey was asking about the top 5, which I think you've probably covered there just now. So Kelsey, if there's anything that you'd still like to ask, then please fire away. Joanna asked, are there some pests or diseases which only show up on mature or immature trees, or do they generally all affect all ages of trees?
Go back to Kelsey's question first, if I may, Sharon. Flora,
Sure.
Is there anything that you would add to that list that you're really concerned about in your role?
I think I probably mentioned, Ips topographus, oak processionary moth. But anything that you're seeing, fire in a tree alert. As Matt says, it's much better that we get to see it and say, oh no, that's nothing to worry about, than we miss something that's really, really damaging.
Yeah, and there was a question a bit lower down, I know, about distribution maps.
Yes.
I think we have to be a bit cautious with those, because if you look at the distribution map for oak processionary moth, it is very much southeast England. That doesn't mean we're only going to find it there. We are more interested in lots of ways when it pops up elsewhere. So a couple of years, I think it was a couple of years ago, it popped up in Derbyshire. So it's important to have an awareness of it, because it doesn't mean they're going to be fully restricted. If they pop up in these remote locations away from that core zone, we can still do something about it if we get in quick enough. So it's really important not to get too tied into, well, it can't be that, it's not been found here. It's just a little bit of a word of warning there.
Can I add to that? I mean, I absolutely agree with Matt saying that. However, I'm really pleased to see that question because it's something that I think I'm really trying to make some progress on, is making the information about distributions easier for you to access. So you could look at your patch and see what is in the neighbouring area. And we used to put sort of static maps on our website. We haven't done that now, and I'm trying to find ways to do something that's a bit more interactive and useful. So probably expect some stakeholder consultation coming out from Scottish Forestry on that in the near future.
That would actually be a lovely thing, and please do include us with that. We can share that with our members. Stephen, you've got your hand up. Have you got follow-up to those questions?
Not quite a follow-up, but I'm a member of a small group of volunteers who look after a council-owned woodland, not a community-owned one. So my question was, does the tree alert system cover such woodlands, or is it only for privately owned?
If there are trees on a site, tree alert covers it.
Right, okay,
it's a quick and easy answer. Yeah, we want to hear about trees anywhere, basically. Right. Pests and diseases don't respect borders or boundaries. They will go anywhere.
For example, last year I noticed a significant increase in the number of galls that we were finding, particularly on young oak. I mean, a significant number of them. So is that the kind of thing that I should raise with the tree alert system, or is that just a natural process?
So that's a really good question. I would still stick to, if you've got doubts, tree alert it. The diagnostic system will quickly go, okay, that's interesting to know about, but we're not concerned about it. Okay, and I know that certainly people sent in a lot of inquiries about, particularly about spangle galls. Certainly around me in the borders here, that oak trees are just absolutely smothered in spangle galls, way more than other years. We're not concerned about it, but that doesn't mean that particular bit of data isn't of interest at some point. Okay. The diagnostics team will really quickly come back to you and say, oh, this is really interesting. We've had a couple of other reports of this, but nothing to worry about.
Okay.
Yeah, does that answer your question, Stephen? Okay.
Yes, it does. Thank you.
Yeah, grand. Thank you. And now I'm going to, sorry, Sharon, I was going to go back to Joanna's question, if that's okay.
I'm holding that question because it's just a follow-up from Stephen's question there that I think is probably quite useful. So Kelsey's come back in saying, when a pest or a disease is identified in woodlands that span over multiple landowners, who should take the lead on containment and eradication efforts? And I suppose my question I would have is, who should also report it?
Can I bat that one in your direction, Flora?
Yeah, that's fine. So if we're talking about statutory pests and it's, you know, a forest block that spans multiple owners, each owner will receive their own statutory plant health notice and they will be responsible for discharging it. So the landowner is the person who is responsible. However, if you have a community group who are offering or engaged or interested in doing some monitoring, I think that would be very silly not to try and talk to them and engage with them. So it is the landowner's responsibility, but actually how they go about it, you know, depends on the relationships that they have. And in terms of who is responsible for reporting, I think we're all responsible for reporting. You know, landowners, sure, they should be doing some monitoring and they should be flagging anything, but I wouldn't rely on that, because the risk is, if they're not, or they haven't spotted something, or perhaps they just don't have the awareness, then there's a pest or disease there that might be building up to some kind of outbreak population that's going to have impact and move on to neighbouring ground. So as we say, tree alert is free, it's free to register, and the information you submit is, you know, photographs and your descriptions. You won't be sort of held responsible for having reported something. So please, I think, generally, if you can, report.
Thank you. Very quickly, if we could respond to Joanna's question very briefly, because there's a point raised about, can we talk a little bit more about that biosecurity and how do we prevent disease? So Joanna's question was, young trees, mature trees, or is it any tree that the pests and diseases enjoy most?
I would say on the whole, they're not that fussy, but there are some exclusions. Not necessarily the disease or pest itself, but how it gets there. So Dutch elm disease. You won't see Dutch elm disease on young elms because the beetles that spread the fungus that causes it like to have a certain thickness of bark before they'll lay their eggs. Now, I used to believe this thing about them flying at a certain height. So until the trees got to that height, the beetles didn't hit them as they flew over, but that's just nonsense. It's all about bark thickness. So there are some cases where, yeah, there's a preference, but a lot of things will not be bothered at all. A younger tree maybe has a lot less resources available to defend itself. So ash dieback, we find that young trees are much more susceptible, but that's partly because of the way the disease works. It releases a lot of spores in the spring, and you get this thick soup of spores 1 or 2 meters above ground level and far fewer above that. So anything that's in that zone, particularly young ash saplings, is getting absolutely hammered with spores. So it's got a much greater chance of being infected and killed as a result. So there are a few differences, but generally, I don't think they're too fussed.
Thank you, Matt. So from our member perspective, they're volunteers managing a community woodland, and they're likely to either have visitors walking through pathways through the woodland, or maybe they've got an enterprise where they have few like log sales, that people turning up with their cars to purchase logs. How do we prevent infection in our woods when we've got that, we've got that traffic happening? What's the best suggestions that you can offer us?
And that will back to Flora. Sorry, Flora.
I mean, I'm not going to pretend that it's not challenging. How often do you go on a woodland walk and see other people cleaning their shoes? I often feel like I'm the only person doing it. So I think some of it's about planning. So if you've got log sales, at a particular place, can you encourage parking on hard standing? Try and reduce the amount of soil that's getting on cars and being taken away. Is there something that you can do like that? Like I said, is there a way of, if you do have something present, particularly, like a Phytophthora, something that could spread in soil on shoes, is there a way that you can encourage people to visit the healthy areas before they hit those areas near infection? Or in fact, can you remove a path or reroute a path? And I know that sounds, quite invasive, but I think it just depends on your site and what the characteristics are. The other thing that I've seen done that I think works really well is, do you have a group of regular users? Is there like a dog walking club or, some kind of group that meet and do the routes regularly? Can you start with them and can you do a demo, take buckets of water and brushes along yourself and start making that small cultural shift with a group where it might start to have a bit of a snowball effect. I think that's where I would start.
Thank you, Flora. We've kind of run out of time, everybody. This has been really interesting and lots of great questions from you. I hope all the questions have been answered. If you have any further questions or feel your question hasn't been asked or answered, then please just email me and I can forward it on to Matt and Flora and then share it all with you when I have a response. So please do that. Matt and Flora, thank you so much for your time today and for sharing this great information session. It's been really useful. I've certainly learned lots myself. And thank you everybody for turning up today and joining us in this session. The recording will go on our YouTube channel and I'll email you all with the links and feedback forms and everything as usual next week. So in the meantime, thank you so much, everybody. It's been lovely having you here.
Thank you. Goodbye.
Bye-bye.